Welcome back. So today we're going to take everything that we've learned. So how to use a meter. Now this meter is going to help us get the correct exposure. And to get the correct exposure, we're going to be adjusting ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Now, using a combination of those three items is going to allow us to get the correct exposure. So we can see right here, this is going to be a correct exposure. But that's not what's important in photography. The exposure or the correct exposure is just something you have to have in photography for the process to work. But what's important are the settings that your shutter speed and your aperture and your ISO are set to, so you can get out of your image specifically what you want. So you can stop action, so you can have a large depth of field, so you can slightly blur an image. That is what's important. That's what we're actually trying to learn to do, not to get the exposure. The exposure is given. It's something that you have to have for the process to work. But what's important is understanding how to get the exact type of photo that you want every single time. So you don't take 100 photos and only 10 of them come out because you messed up the others. You want every time you take an image for that image to come out perfect. And that is done by setting, most of the time, your shutter speed and your aperture. The ISO plays into it, but what really controls how your photo looks is going to be more often than not your shutter speed, aperture. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to quickly review ISO, aperture, and shutter speed just so everybody remembers what we're talking about. And then we're going to go into exposures and equivalent exposures, and I'm going to show you how all three of these things work in conjunction. So remember, if we are minus, our image is going to be too dark. If we are plus, it's going to be too bright. If you do not see this little guy in your camera or on the back of the camera, it means your exposure is so far off that you're going to need to make more than a 2-stop adjustment. Or if you have 3 stops, more than a 3-stop adjustment. So you're looking to get this here. Now, it's important to note, just because the little dot is here doesn't mean that your exposure is correct. What I do is I'll set it at 0, I'll take a picture, and I'll look at that image. Now, depending on how much white and how much black and how much other information is in the photo is going to determine kind of how that image is metered. And it's not always metered correctly. Actually, most of the time it's off. It's not off a lot, usually only a third of stop, but it will be off. So I'll take a picture and then I'll make an adjustment. Even if my meter's then telling me that I'm going to be a little under or overexposed, don't worry about that. It doesn't have to be on 0. What you're trying to do is get a good exposure. You can turn on highlight priority on your camera so the highlights will blink if you overexpose them. That's always one thing that you can do. And you're better off to shoot a little bit dark rather than a little bit bright. All right, so this is a little thing that I made up for my students. And this prints to wallet size, so you can easily throw it in any wallet or anything that holds a credit card. This folds in half right here. And I am going to have this available for anybody who wants it to download it and go ahead and print it out. Now, the first thing that we have here is our shutter speed. And the shutter speed is in full stops. Remember, they do go in third stops, but we are working in full stops. I started with 30 and then 60, then 125, then 250, then 500 and 1,000. I have 2 numbers highlighted, 60 and 500. 60 is the minimum shutter speed that you can take handheld, meaning you're holding the camera of a non-moving object and have it not be blurry. Now, these little blurry things have to do with action. They don't have to do with handheld images. So this person is supposed to be running. The next one is 500. 500 is the minimum shutter speed to stop action. You're going to be better off using 1,000, but 500 is the minimum. Down here in red, I have more information about shutter speed. So this is a slow shutter speed. This is a fast shutter speed. This lets in less light. So as your speed gets faster, it's letting in less light. And as it goes slower, it's letting in more light. Lower your shutter speed, the more blur motion you can get in an image. So if you're trying to purposely blur something, you're going to shoot at a slower shutter speed. And shutter speeds go much further in this direction. And they also go further in this direction. And the last thing is stop motion. So the faster the shutter speed, you increase your ability to stop action or motion. Down here we have ISO. So 200 is where I've started. Most cameras are going to start at 100, but we're going to go 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, 6400. Very easy because each number doubles itself. This is a little bit confusing, and students in the beginning have trouble with this. So I have 200, and in this case, I have more light. But what this means is it's not letting in more light. You need more light to make an exposure. So this is very important. So right here, we're letting in more light. This more light means you need more light to make an exposure. Down here, you need less light to make an exposure. This sensor is more sensitive. This sensor is less sensitive. So because of that, you need more light to make an exposure and less light here to make an exposure. The trade-off of ISO is you're going to have a finer grain down here. So you're going to have better image quality. The lower the number, you're going to have coarse grain, or in the case of digital, you're going to have more noise as you get higher in your ISO. So it's important to note, ISO is usually the first thing that I'm setting. The last thing that we have here is aperture or f-stop. And you can see the black area is the open part of the shutter. So the f4, 5.6, 11, and 16. This is the one that people tend to have the most difficult with because they tend to think the higher number should be the larger opening and the smaller number, the smaller opening. Well, it's not the case. That the larger number is actually a smaller opening. The smaller number is actually a larger opening. They get that confused. Plus the numbering system isn't very logical because it goes 4, 5, 6, F8, 11, 16. Down here at F4, we can see it's letting in more light. And as we get smaller, it's letting in less light. Why? Well, because the opening is much smaller. So the lower the number lets in more light, higher the number lets in less light. The second aspect here, and we can see this we have this little guy, and notice the background is all blurry. It has a shallow depth of field. And there's actually 3 things that determine depth of field. I'm not going to go into them right now because I have a separate video for it, but aperture is one of them. If you have a large aperture, you're going to have a shallow depth of field. If you have a small aperture, you're going to have a great depth of field. You can see here, out of focus a lot. This is just a little bit in focus, the mountains in the back here, and here both things are in focus. And that is how the aperture works. Now there's trade-offs when you do certain aspects in photography. So as we move our shutter speed up, it's letting in less light. So what we have to do to get the correct exposure is to let more light in somewhere. Now, the first thing that you need to do before you start adjusting your exposure is to set your ISO somewhere. And what we're trying to do is set our ISO so it gives us a range with our camera. And that range means that I can shoot at maybe a 60th of a second up to a 1,000th of a second. So that ISO setting might let me use both of those extremes, 60 all the way up to 1,000. Now, this takes time to learn. I've made this chart kind of give you an idea of where to set this so you're not struggling in the beginning. So if you're outside and it is bright and sunny, you can set it at 100 to 200. Now this is going to be determined on the minimum aperture of your lens. So the faster lens you have, meaning the lower aperture, the lower the number can be. But if you have a variable aperture that's like 5, 6 to 7, you're going to need to be at 200 or even higher. But in general, start with these numbers and then work your way around. So if it's sunny, 100 to 200. If it's cloudy, somewhere between 400 and 800. And remember, there's 30 stops in between here that you can definitely use. And if it's dark or you're indoors, around 1600 to 3200. Once again, we have this little thing down here. So needs more light, less sensitive. Needs less light, more sensitive. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is take a look at this thing called equivalent exposures, and I'll explain what that means in a second. Right here, we have ISO, we have shutter speed, and we have aperture. And for each one of those, I have in green circled something, and this is going to be our first exposure. So we're saying on this image, the perfect exposure is going to be an ISO of 400. A shutter speed of 125, and an aperture of f4. The first thing we need to do is kind of think here. If I have those settings, why do I have those settings? What could I be taking a picture of? Well, we know the subject isn't moving really fast because we know a minimum of a 500th of a second, and this is slower than 500th of a second. So it's not going to be stopping action. We have an aperture of f4, so this is going to be a shallow depth of field. So it's probably not a landscape because everything isn't going to be in focus. And we have an ISO of 400, and that's in the cloudy setting. So we know that the day is probably overcast or cloudy, not a sunny day. So that is giving us an idea of what these settings are doing. So I can look just at these settings and kind of have an idea of what I'm doing. What would be something that I would be taking a picture of? It's simple. We could easily be doing a portrait of a person on a cloudy day. Now, what happens if we need to change this exposure? A lot of times what beginning students do is they get the exposure, it comes out, and they just start taking photos and photos and photos. And that doesn't really help you. There's terminology in photography called equivalent exposures. And an equivalent exposure is where you change the settings, but the exposure is exactly the same. So we're going to turn on the first of the equivalent exposures. And what we're doing here, and I've circled this in magenta, we are moving our shutter speed up 2 spots. When you see these arrows, this means it's going up 1 whole stop, 2 whole stops. So in this case, because I'm going up, it's letting in less light. So we are 2 stops less light. So when I make this adjustment, remember this was a perfect exposure. Now my image is going to be too dark because the only thing that I've moved is my shutter speed. So what I need to do is adjust something else, allow more light back into the camera to get an equivalent exposure. The first option here is to take ISO 400 and move it 1 stop up to 800, because as we go this way, we need less light to make an exposure. That's the confusing part. Remember, ISO can be kind of confusing. As you go like this, you need less light to make an exposure. So in turn, it's really like allowing more light into the camera. It's just you don't need as much light to take the same exposure. So this is doing +1 stop. This is doing -2 stops. Then we can take F4 and go to 2.8 because as we go this way, it lets more light in. An equivalent exposure of 125 F4 at 400, 500, 800, 2.8. Both of those exposures are exactly the same, but the numbers in the outcome of what you get from the image is completely different. In this version, the green one, it would work good for a non-moving subject. However, now we're moving up to 500th of a second, and that must mean that we need to stop some sort of action that's happening in the image. And this could be for any reason, that your model starts running around because they're a little kid, or an alien lands on Earth and you're trying to stop the action of the alien landing on Earth. So you need to be able to quickly adjust this. Now, quickly adjusting the ISO is always the easiest thing because usually you have to press a button and move it. It's actually usually easier to adjust the aperture. But in this case, remember, we went up 1 stop, 2 stops. But we can only go down 1 stop because we don't have a smaller aperture than 2.8. So in this case, we are forced to either move 1 stop this way and 1 stop this way, or we could not use this aperture here. In this second version, you can see before, remember, we moved 1 stop from f4 to 2.8, but now we're going to be moving 2 stops, 1, 2, the other way, and we're just going to be moving the ISO instead of moving the aperture. So we're going to go 1, 2 here, 1, 2 here. In equivalent exposures, it doesn't really matter whether you move the aperture, the shutter speed, the ISO. It's just, it needs to be equivalent so you get the same exposure. And this is a great way to learn what your camera does and how to quickly adjust your camera. And truthfully, I'm going to tell you this, until you can quickly do this, you're going to struggle in photography. Don't expect to watch this video and be able to do this. This is going to be taking weeks. When I teach beginning photography, I go over this for the first 5 or 6 weeks with students. It takes a long time for them to kind of get the gist of it and be able to start to move this at some sort of ease. If you just set your exposure and take your photos and you never adjust anything, you're going to learn at a slower pace than if you take maybe not as exciting photos, but you learn to manipulate or move your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO and get equivalent exposures. You'll actually learn faster, and in the long run, it's definitely going to benefit you. We will turn this off. So remember, we have first exposure of f4, 125, 400. That's our exposure. I'm going to turn on the equivalent exposure. In this case, we're going up 1 stop, 2 stops to 500th of a second to stop action. We're letting in 2 stops less light. So we need to let 2 stops more light into this image. So we're going to go from f4 to 2.8. That's going to let in 1 stop. And from 400 to 800, that's going to let in 2 stops. That's going to be the same exposure, but your settings are going to be different on your camera, and it's going to give you a different outcome. In this case, it's going to allow you to stop action. The second version, we go up 1 stop, 2 stops here, and we can simply go 1 stop, 2 stops here. Now, if we had this at 5.6, we could have just gone down 1, 2 on our aperture there. So if you remember, I said we need to set our ISO so we have a working range. So you can see the working range doesn't work really good in this exposure because it would be a whole lot easier when I went from 125 to 250 to 500 to just go bam, bam, and not have to adjust our ISO. It's much quicker to adjust your aperture and your shutter speed than it is your ISO. So if you need to do this quickly, it's much easier just to move one or the other. One thing that would be going through my head when I initially set up my ISO is maybe I need to bump this up to 800 because I would prefer to have this at 5.6. So if I do need to go up to 500th of a second, I will have the availability to move quickly my aperture. Now, this is all something that you need to think about. This is the very, very first thing that I do when I set up my camera is try to decide where to put my ISO. At this point in time, I can pretty much look at the lighting circumstance and pretty much guess my exposure. This is something you're going to want to work towards, and it makes a huge difference in photography. You don't have to think about these settings and getting your exposure correctly. You can think about other things like composition, light, and everything else that's going on in an image. You don't want to spend your time trying to figure out the exposure when you're taking someone's photo. That should be something that you do and is really easy. What you want to spend your time doing is putting them in the right position, getting them comfortable, getting the composition right, getting the light right. All right, so this is going to be our next exposure. So we are at 3200, shutter speed of 60th of a second, and 2.8. What can we tell from here? Well, this is letting in a lot of light. This is letting in a lot of light. And this is more sensitive, so it needs less light to make an exposure. So I can tell that most likely I am indoors in a pretty dark situation. I have everything maxed out for a low light situation. Now I've stopped at 60th because I know if I go below 60th, I'm going to have a difficult time keeping any image sharp, because below that, I'm going to start to get a little bit of motion blur from not being able to hold the camera still enough. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn on the next adjustment here for this equivalent exposure. And I'm going to say that I'm going to go to from 60th of a second, once again, 1 stop, 2 stop, 3 stops this time. So we're going up to 500th of a second. So we know that something's happening in this classroom. Maybe a raccoon just ran through the door and jumped on some kid's head, and we want to stop the action and get that exposure. We know to stop action, we need at least a 500th of a second. So we went up 1, 2, 3 stops. So that's 3 stops less light. We need to get that light back from somewhere else to have the correct exposure. Now we're at 2.8. Remember, this lets the most amount of light in, and we can't go any lower, so we can't adjust this here. The only thing that we can adjust to let more light in the camera is to make the camera's sensor more sensitive. So I can go from 3200 to 6400, but that only lets in 1 stop of light. Well, what happens if my ISO stops at 6400, which most won't, but we're just going to assume that? Well, this movement is going to be impossible. Basically, I can't take a picture in this situation because I've maxed out the adjustments on my camera. Where I went up 1, 2, 3 stops here, even though I would like to let more light in, I just can't simply do that. So I can go 1 stop here, but I still need 2 more stops from somewhere else. The best option would have been to have a really fast lens where there are numbers below 2.8, so I could let more light in there, or have higher ISO. Now, most cameras are going to have a higher ISO, so you could go those extra 2 stops. But what you'll run into occasionally is sometimes when you try to make an equivalent exposure, you just run out of room and you can't make the adjustment to do what you want to do. All right, let's take a look at our next little card here. And we have an ISO setting of 200, a shutter speed of 250, and an aperture of 5.6, and this is our perfect exposure. What can we read from this? So we know it's pretty bright and pretty sunny. Our subject isn't running, but we want a decent shutter speed. Now, a lot of times you're going to have a high shutter speed just to compensate for the amount of light. So just because you set it at something doesn't always mean that it's there for a specific reason. But in this case, we're just going to assume that's true. So we're kind of like in the middle of the road for a lot of this. It's not something that's not moving, and it's not something moving fast. We don't have a super shallow depth of field. However, it's not a landscape. We don't have a large depth of field. So we're just kind of in the middle of the road. So what we're going to do is turn on our equivalent exposure. And the first thing that we're going to do here is take our speed once again, and we're going to go 250, 500 to 8,000. So now we're moving up to 1,000th of a second. Why would we do that? Well, because something is moving really fast. So we are trying to stop the action of something that's moving really fast. So since we moved this up 2 numbers, we have 2 stops less light. So we need 2 stops more light in this situation. Now, there are a bunch of different configurations this time that we can use to get this exposure. The first one is we can go from 200 to 400. That's going to let 1 stop light in there. And we can go from 5.6 to f4. That's going to let 1 stop in there. So 1, 2 stops there. So 1 stop here, 1 stop here. But that adds up to 2 stops more light. 1,400 f4 is going to be the same, is going to be an equivalent exposure to the 200, 250, 5.6. And also, I'm going to turn off the aperture, just move the ISO up 2 spots. Go from 200 to 400 and from 400 to 800. If I had my exposure here, if I move my ISO to 800, that's going to be 2 stops. 1, 2, 1, 2. By moving those two stops from 200 to 400 to 800, so we're going here, we're having two stops more light, making our sensor more sensitive, but we're gaining two stops of light. So we're going 1, 2. So an equivalent exposure is going to be 800, 1000, 5, 6. That's going to be our first option. I'm going to turn off the ISO adjustment and turn the aperture back in. Now we can do one stop here, but we can also do another one. And then our equivalent exposure is going to be 28, 1200. We could either do two stops here or two stops here. It doesn't make a difference where you do the two stops as long as you make the two stops. Now, our picture is going to come out different. It's going to have a finer grain and it's going to have a shallower depth of field. A lot of times when you're trying to stop action, it's one specific thing. This is probably going to be a better option. Well, why? Because we're going to have better image quality at 200 than at 800. And aperture isn't going to be quite as important. And what you'll find out when you start doing this is sometimes shutter speed is the most important aspect of your settings, and sometimes aperture is the most important setting. And then sometimes they're kind of 50-50 where they're equal. So we had multiple ways to do this. We could either go one stop here, two stops here, or two stops here. We had three different options. All were equivalent exposures, but the outcome is different. The settings on our camera are going to be different, and they're going to have that image turn out a little bit different in each one of those variables because the settings are different. That is how you adjust your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture to get your exposure first of all. So the first thing is to use that light meter, get the exposure. And then once you get that exposure, you want to try to get some equivalent exposures. And the reason for this is so you can get used to adjusting your camera the correct direction. Don't be surprised if you move it the wrong direction and it gets totally bright or totally dark because you move them the wrong direction. The key here is to get used to adjusting your camera so you can make quick equivalent exposure adjustments and truthfully just work your camera so that you know what you're doing. This takes time and practice. You need to go out every day, take photos, and you need to constantly adjust your camera. I would rather at this point you practice taking really boring photos but adjusting your camera than getting the exposure and going out and trying to take amazing photos. Well, why? Because at this point, we're trying to learn how to use the camera, not how to take great images at this point. So go out and practice. Don't be surprised if you have to come back and watch this video over and over and over again because you don't remember how. I'm going to have a lot of this stuff up on my website. So if you're interested in downloading any of these little items, what I'm going to have available for download is this little chart here. And this you can print out and stick in your wallet or carry and take with you anywhere. This is probably the most useful. And that's why I made it this size because I knew you were going to need to have something to carry around. I have a chart that's like this, but it's completely blank. It actually has two of these per page. And this will allow you to kind of just on pen and paper, go ahead and practice your equivalent exposures. And I might add a couple of other slides that we've had that we've used in the past that I'll put on there. So if you are interested in that information, that is going to be down below in the description. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. If you have any comments or questions, you can leave those below. And as always, don't forget to subscribe.